The grand ballroom of the luxury Crescent Palace Hotel in New York fell into stunned silence the moment a sharp ripping sound tore through the air beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of wealthy guests froze mid-conversation, their champagne glasses hovering inches from their lips, as a young server stood trembling near the VIP section, clutching the torn remains of his white service jacket. His cheeks flushed crimson with humiliation while cameras flashed from every direction, capturing the moment for social media feeds that would explode within hours. The sound of fabric tearing had been so violent, so deliberate, that it seemed to echo off the marble columns and gilded ceilings like a gunshot in a cathedral. The alpha who had grabbed his uniform and ripped the fabric apart wore a triumphant smirk on his handsome face. Julian Davenport, the notorious playboy son of a real estate mogul, straightened his custom Italian suit and adjusted his silk tie as if he had just accomplished something worthy of praise. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of chiseled jaw that graced magazine covers. But his blue eyes held nothing but cold arrogance as he looked down at the Omega who dared to exist in his presence. His pheromones, sharp and aggressive like burning cedar and whiskey, flooded the space around him with deliberate intent. He wanted everyone to feel his dominance, to understand that he was an alpha of consequence. "I told you to watch where you were going," Julian sneered, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom with practiced theatricality. "You think because you're serving drinks at a charity gala, you have the right to breathe the same air as actual important people? Learn your place, Omega. Get out of my sight before I have you fired and blacklisted from every hotel in this city." He gestured dismissively with one manicured hand, the diamond-encrusted watch on his wrist catching the light. "People like you are a dime a dozen. Replaceable. Forgotten the moment you leave this room." The young server, whose name was Ethan Morrow, kept his amber eyes fixed on the marble floor. At 27 years old, Ethan had learned long ago that the safest response to alpha aggression was complete submission. His slender but distinctly male frame trembled beneath his ruined uniform, his pale skin flushed with the heat of public shame. Dark curls, the color of espresso, fell across his forehead as he lowered his head further, exposing the back of his neck in an instinctive gesture of Omega deference that only seemed to amuse his tormentor further. His jaw was strong despite his slender build, his shoulders carrying the lean musculature of a man who worked hard and stayed active. There was nothing soft or feminine about Ethan Morrow. He was simply an Omega man trying to survive in a world that often saw his designation as a weakness. Several hotel employees rushed forward but froze when Julian shot them a warning glare. His father owned half the commercial properties in Manhattan, and no one dared risk their livelihood by intervening. The other guests watched with varying expressions, some uncomfortable, others amused, a few secretly recording on their phones. The beta actress clinging to Julian's arm, a woman named Lana who had made her career playing vapid arm candy in forgettable films, laughed openly at Ethan's humiliation. "Oh my God, Julian, you're so dramatic," she cooed, though her eyes glittered with cruel enjoyment. But honestly, these people need to learn their place. No one spoke. No one moved. The power of wealth and alpha status held the room in an iron grip that no one dared challenge. The whispers that rippled through the crowd were not words of protest, but of speculation. Who was this Omega? Why was Julian so aggressive? Would anyone actually intervene? The answers to all those questions were depressingly predictable. Julian was a powerful alpha with connections. Ethan was an anonymous server. And in the world of the wealthy elite, that was all that mattered. But within minutes, one unexpected arrival would expose a truth so astonishing that everyone in that room, including the arrogant alpha who had just committed the ultimate social sin, would wish they could erase what had just happened. Before the story continues, if you believe that kindness transcends hierarchy and that every Omega deserves respect regardless of their circumstances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another heart-touching story. Ethan Moreau had never wanted to be the center of attention. His entire life had been a careful exercise in invisibility, a survival strategy honed over years of navigating a world that valued alpha strength above all else. He was 27 years old, with a gentle demeanor that had become well known among the staff of the Crescent Palace Hotel. Every employee admired his humility because he never treated anyone differently, whether they were a dishwasher scrubbing pots in the basement kitchen or a billionaire checking into the presidential suite. He had a quiet way of making people feel seen, a talent for listening without judgment, and a work ethic that impressed even the most demanding managers. What no one knew, what Ethan had guarded with fierce determination, was that he was not merely a part-time server scraping together a living in one of New York's most expensive hotels. Ethan had once been one of the most influential Omega philanthropists in the country after marrying Alexander Brooks, the founder of Brooks Technologies, one of the fastest-growing corporations in America. Together they had built scholarships, funded children's hospitals, and quietly donated millions to struggling families across the United States. Their names appeared on donor walls in hospitals and schools from coast to coast, though Ethan had always insisted on using his maiden name for his philanthropic work, keeping his private life completely separate. Alexander and Ethan had met 5 years earlier at a charity auction, two men from vastly different worlds who recognized something essential in each other. Alexander was the alpha scion of a tech empire, tall and commanding with sharp gray eyes that saw through pretense. At 48 years old, he had already built an empire through sheer force of will, his silver-streaked temples and weathered hands bearing the marks of a man who had worked hard for everything he had. He was broad-shouldered and powerful, the kind of alpha who commanded respect simply by walking into a room. But beneath that formidable exterior was a man of deep compassion and surprising tenderness. Ethan was a quiet Omega from a modest background, working as an event coordinator for the charity hosting the auction. He was 22 at the time, fresh out of graduate school, determined to make a difference in the world despite the limitations his designation imposed. His amber eyes held a wisdom beyond his years, and his gentle smile had a way of disarming even the most guarded individuals. The moment Alexander had seen him across the crowded room, he had felt something shift inside him, something primal and undeniable. Their connection had been immediate and intense, the kind of scent compatibility that stories were written about. Alexander's sandalwood and cedar pheromones had wrapped around Ethan's jasmine and vanilla scent like they were made to complement each other. Within 6 months, they were married in a small ceremony that Ethan had insisted remain private. He had never wanted to become a public figure, even as Alexander's wealth and influence grew exponentially. "The world doesn't need to know who I am," Ethan had told his husband during their engagement, his voice soft but firm. "I want to help people without the protection of your name or your money. I want to understand what they actually need, not what the wealthy assume they need. If people know I'm your husband, they'll treat me differently. They'll see privilege instead of purpose." That belief led him to volunteer several evenings each month as an ordinary server at charity events, refusing special treatment and never revealing his marriage. The work was grounding, he explained to Alexander. It kept him connected to reality. It reminded him that the purpose of their wealth was service, not status. He would arrive at the hotel in his simple uniform, take his assignments like any other employee, and disappear into the work of helping others. Alexander had reluctantly agreed, though he worried constantly about his Omega's safety. "You're too trusting," he would say, brushing Ethan's dark curls from his forehead with a gentle hand. "Not everyone deserves your kindness. There are people in this world who will take advantage of you the moment you let your guard down. Everyone deserves kindness," Ethan would reply, his amber eyes soft with unwavering conviction. "That's the whole point of what we do. If we only help people who are easy to help, we're not really helping anyone." He would reach up to touch Alexander's face, his thumb tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I'll be careful. I promise. but I can't let fear stop me from doing what I believe in. That evening, the Crescent Palace Hotel was hosting one of the biggest charity galas in New York. Politicians, celebrities, CEOs, investors, and journalists filled the magnificent ballroom, their combined wealth representing billions of dollars in economic power. The event's guest of honor was Marcus Sterling, the ambitious CEO of Sterling Global Holdings, a shipping and logistics empire that had expanded into tech, real estate, and media over the past decade. He was a respected figure in the business community, known for his ruthless negotiation tactics and his carefully cultivated public image. Walking beside him was his younger brother, Julian Davenport Sterling, though Julian preferred to drop the Sterling part of his name when it suited him. He was the family's spoiled second son, an alpha who had never been required to work for anything in his entire life. He was handsome in a conventional, magazine cover way, with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes that had charmed countless omegas into his bed. But behind the perfect smile was a cruel streak that his wealth and status had only amplified. Julian believed that alphas were naturally superior, that omegas existed to serve and submit, and that anyone who challenged that hierarchy deserved to be crushed beneath his heel. Standing beside him was his current companion, a leggy beta actress named Lana who clung to his arm like an expensive accessory. She wore a dress that cost more than most people's annual salaries and smirked whenever Julian humiliated someone beneath them. Her career had been built on her willingness to be seen rather than heard, and she had perfected the art of looking beautiful while saying nothing of substance. Ethan carefully carried a silver tray filled with sparkling water toward the VIP table where Marcus Sterling was seated. He moved with practiced grace, weaving through the crowd of wealthy guests who barely registered his presence. His uniform was simple but immaculate, his dark hair neatly combed, his scent muted with a neutralizer patch on his wrist to prevent any accidental pheromone release that might be considered provocative in such a high-alpha environment. He had done this dozens of times before, blending into the background, serving without being seen, slipping through the cracks of a world that had no interest in him. As he approached the VIP table, another guest accidentally brushed against his shoulder while trying to take a selfie with a famous actress. The impact was minor, barely a jostle, but it was enough to upset the tray. One glass tipped over, spilling only a few drops of water onto the tablecloth near Julian's designer watch. The droplets sparkled on the white linen like tiny diamonds, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The tiny accident could have been solved with a napkin and a simple apology. It was nothing. Inconsequential. A moment that would have been forgotten in seconds if not for the volatile alpha who saw it as an opportunity. You. Julian's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade, sharp and filled with venom. He didn't raise his voice, but the menace in his tone made everyone within earshot freeze. Do you have any idea how much this watch costs? It's a Patek Philippe, you worthless omega. One drop of water could damage the mechanism. One drop of your pathetic presence could ruin something worth more than your entire life. Ethan immediately bowed his head, his heart racing in his chest. His training as a server had taught him how to handle difficult guests, but this felt different. There was something predatory in Julian's eyes, something that went beyond simple irritation. I'm so sorry, sir. I'll get a napkin immediately. I can have the watch professionally cleaned. Get a napkin? Julian laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. He stood from his seat, his full height imposing, his alpha pheromones flooding the space with aggressive intent. You think a napkin solves this? You think your pathetic apology means anything? He stepped closer, invading Ethan's personal space with deliberate menace. People like you will never understand the value of success. You're born to serve, to clean up after your betters, to know your place and stay in it. Your entire existence is defined by what you can do for alphas like me. Ethan kept his eyes lowered, his hands trembling slightly around the silver tray. His jaw was tight, his muscles tense with the effort of remaining still. He could feel the weight of dozens of stares on him, could hear the whispers starting to spread through the nearby tables. His cheeks burned with humiliation, but he refused to respond with anger. His husband had taught him that dignity was sometimes stronger than argument, that maintaining one's composure in the face of cruelty was its own form of victory. He would not give this alpha the satisfaction of seeing him break. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "If you'll allow me, I can have the watch professionally cleaned. I understand your concern, and I want to make things right." "Inconvenience." Julian's voice rose, drawing even more attention. The people at surrounding tables had stopped their conversations entirely, watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination. Some had their phones out, recording the confrontation. "You think this is an inconvenience? This is a lesson you clearly need to learn." He reached out and grabbed Ethan by the front of his white service jacket, his fingers curling into the starched fabric. The fabric tore with a sound like thunder in the suddenly silent room. Buttons flew across the polished marble floor, skittering and bouncing like tiny pearls. The jacket ripped open, revealing the simple, white shirt beneath. Ethan gasped, stumbling backward, but Julian held the torn fabric in his fist, triumph blazing in his blue eyes. The alpha's pheromones spiked with satisfaction, the scent of conquest filling the air around them. Gasps filled the ballroom. Some guests looked away in embarrassment while others leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. Several hotel employees rushed forward, but fear of offending the powerful alpha kept everyone frozen. Even Marcus Sterling, Julian's older brother and the CEO of the company hosting the event, remained seated, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't approve of his brother's behavior, but he also didn't want to cause a scene in front of all these influential guests. Maintaining appearances was more important than protecting a nameless server. Ethan stood perfectly still, his arms instinctively crossing to cover himself. His dark curls had fallen across his forehead, and his amber eyes shimmered with unshed tears. But he refused to let them fall. He refused to give Julian the satisfaction of seeing him truly break. His silence somehow carried more strength than any insult could, a quiet defiance that spoke volumes. "That's right," Julian sneered, dropping the torn fabric to the floor. He stood over Ethan, his shadow falling across the Omega's trembling form. "You just stand there and take it. That's what you're good for, isn't it? Standing there and taking whatever we give you." He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms as if expecting applause. This is what happens when Omegas forget their place. They need to be reminded. They need to be shown that they're nothing. Nobody. Expendable. Marcus Sterling finally stood, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Julian, that's enough." His voice was low and controlled, the voice of an alpha who was used to being obeyed. "You've made your point. Let it go." Julian shrugged off his brother's hand, his eyes still fixed on Ethan. "I'm not done yet. This Omega needs to learn a proper lesson. He needs to understand." "You're done," Marcus said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "Sit down." Grumbling, Julian returned to his seat, but his eyes never left Ethan. There was something in his gaze, a hunger for more dominance, more control. He wasn't satisfied. He wouldn't be satisfied until he had completely broken the Omega standing before him. Ethan knelt down slowly, gathering the torn fabric of his jacket. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, but he forced himself to move deliberately, to not show weakness. He could feel the stares burning into his skin, the weight of public humiliation pressing down on him like a physical force. The other guests had returned to their conversations, but he could hear the whispers, could feel the pity, the disgust, the amusement. "What's wrong with him?" someone at the next table asked, their voice carrying across the space with cruel curiosity. "Why doesn't he just fight back? Doesn't he have any pride?" "Because he knows his place," another voice answered, smug and satisfied. "He's an Omega. He's probably used to it." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, taking a steadying breath. His hands clenched around the torn fabric, knuckles white with suppressed emotion. He thought of Alexander, of his husband's strong arms and unwavering support. He thought of the life they had built together, the difference they had made in so many lives. He thought of all the times Alexander had told him he was the bravest person he'd ever known, that his strength came not from his designation, but from his heart. Finally, Ethan stood, clutching his ruined jacket to his chest, and walked toward the employee exit. His steps were slow and measured, each one a conscious effort to maintain his composure. He could feel Julian's eyes following him, could smell the alpha's lingering aggression in the air. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Outside the ballroom, a black luxury sedan quietly stopped beneath the hotel's entrance canopy. Security guards instantly recognized the passengers stepping out, their postures shifting to one of deference and respect. Alexander Brooks, the founder and CEO of Brooks Technologies, was worth an estimated $18 billion, but more than that, he was a man whose influence extended far beyond his wealth. He was known for his integrity, his generosity, and his fierce protection of those he loved. At 50 years old, Alexander Brooks was still an imposing figure. His silver-streaked temples and the lines around his eyes spoke of years of hard work and relentless ambition. His gray eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing. His jaw was strong, his frame broad and powerful in a custom-tailored navy suit that had been made for him by a Savile Row tailor. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing, who had clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and brilliance. Alexander had returned unexpectedly from a business meeting in California after learning that Ethan planned to volunteer at the gala. He wanted to surprise his Omega by joining the charity auction later that evening. It had been a long week apart, and he missed his husband with an intensity that still surprised him after 5 years of marriage. But as he walked into the hotel, his sensitive alpha instincts immediately detected something wrong. The air was thick with tension, the kind of charged atmosphere that followed a major confrontation. And then he caught it, faint but unmistakable, the fading trace of Ethan's jasmine and vanilla scent. But mixed with it was something else. Fear, humiliation, stress. His Omega's distress was written in every molecular trace of that fading scent, and Alexander's heart dropped like a stone. Alexander's face darkened, his expression shifting from anticipation to something cold and dangerous. He moved toward the ballroom with long, purposeful strides, ignoring the hotel staff who tried to greet him. His alpha instincts were roaring to life, demanding to know why his Omega was distressed, demanding to find him and protect him. The neutralizer patch on his wrist was useless against the surge of protective pheromones that flooded his system. As he walked into the ballroom, his eyes immediately met Ethan's. For one heartbreaking second, Alexander saw everything. The torn uniform hanging off his Omega's lean frame. His mate's tear-filled amber eyes, swimming with unshed tears. The frightened expression Ethan tried desperately to hide. The way his arms were crossed over his chest, the visible trembling in his shoulders. His husband had been humiliated, hurt, degraded in front of hundreds of people. And Alexander hadn't been there to stop it. His smile of anticipation disappeared instantly, replaced by something that made the nearest guests step back involuntarily. The powerful alpha's presence had shifted the atmosphere like a storm front moving in, his pheromones flooding the space with protective aggression. Everyone in the room felt it, the overwhelming sense that something momentous was about to happen. Alexander crossed the ballroom in seconds, his long legs eating up the distance. The guests parted before him like the Red Sea, instinctively deferring to his overwhelming presence. He reached Ethan and gently removed his own tailored suit jacket, wrapping it around his Omega's shoulders with tender care. The jacket enveloped Ethan's slender frame, carrying the familiar scent of sandalwood and cedar that had always been his safe space. "Ethan," he said, his voice rough with emotion. His hands cupped his husband's face, tilting it up so he could meet his eyes. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Ethan shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. The tears he had held back earlier spilled down his cheeks, and he pressed his face against Alexander's chest, breathing in his husband's familiar scent. The comfort was immediate, the safety overwhelming. His body sagged against Alexander's, all the tension draining out of him. Alexander wrapped his arms around his Omega, pulling him close. He could feel the trembling in Ethan's body, could smell the distress rolling off him in waves. The neutralizer patch on Ethan's wrist had been partially torn away during the altercation, and his natural scent was leaking through, a clear sign of an Omega in extreme stress. His hands moved in soothing circles on Ethan's back, his voice a low murmur of comfort. "Shoo," Alexander murmured against Ethan's dark curls. "I'm here. I've got you. You're safe now." He didn't release his hold, instead turning to face the room with his Omega sheltered protectively in his arms. His gray eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the guilty expressions, the downcast gazes, the furtive looks of those who had witnessed everything and done nothing. The room remained completely silent. Then a hotel executive whispered his name in disbelief. "Alexander Brooks." Within seconds, whispers spread through every table like wildfire. Guests suddenly realized that the quiet server was standing beside one of America's youngest billionaire philanthropists, the founder of Brooks Technologies, the man whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings across the country. Ethan's identity wasn't just that of a server. He was the Omega husband of Alexander Brooks, the man whose charitable foundation had donated hundreds of millions to children's education, medical research, and poverty relief across the United States. Even more shocking, Ethan had personally funded scholarships for hotel employees' children without ever attaching his name to the donations. The quiet Omega who had been treated like garbage by Julian Davenport Sterling was one of the most generous philanthropists in the country. His name appeared on the donor lists of dozens of organizations, always listed as anonymous, or the Morrow Foundation, a tribute to his maiden name. The atmosphere completely changed. People who had remained silent moments earlier now lowered their heads in shame. Several guests who had recorded the incident on their phones hastily deleted the footage, though others held on to it as evidence. A few attendees actually looked as if they might be sick with the realization of what they had allowed to happen. The whispers had shifted from speculation to horror, from amusement to shame. Marcus Sterling rose from his seat, his face pale as bone. He had just realized that his brother's cruelty had been directed at one of the most powerful men in the country. He approached Alexander with hesitant steps, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Alexander," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his deep concern. "I had no idea. I didn't know who he was. I'm so sorry." "You're sorry." Alexander's voice was ice, cold enough to freeze the air between them. He didn't release Ethan, his protective embrace never wavering. "Your brother publicly humiliated my Omega, tore his uniform, called him worthless, made him kneel in front of hundreds of people, and you sat there and did nothing." Marcus swallowed hard, his alpha composure cracking. I didn't know who he was. His identity doesn't matter." Alexander cut him off, his alpha pheromones spiking with barely contained fury. He could have been a server with nothing to his name. He could have been the janitor, the dishwasher, the lowest paid employee in this hotel. He's still a person your brother decided to brutalize for the crime of existing in his presence. He turned his piercing gray eyes to Julian, who had gone remarkably pale, for the crime of being an Omega. Julian was staring at Alexander with a mixture of disbelief and mounting horror. He had just crossed a line that could destroy his entire family. The Brooks name carried weight in ways the Sterling Davenport empire couldn't match. And Alexander Brooks was known for protecting what was his with a ferocity that bordered on legendary. I didn't know," Julian stammered, for the first time in his life sounding like the spoiled child he truly was. "He was just a server. Just an Omega. I didn't mean." "He's my husband," Alexander said coldly, each word dropping like a hammer blow. "And he's worth 1,000 of you." He turned to face the room, his voice rising so that everyone could hear. "Let me be clear about something. My husband volunteers here because he believes in humility. Because he believes that everyone deserves respect regardless of their status or their designation. He has donated more money to charity than everyone in this room combined. And he did it anonymously because he wanted to help people, not receive recognition. Alexander's voice had risen now, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. His pheromones were a palpable force, pressing down on everyone in the room with the weight of his anger and his grief. And tonight, your guest stood by and watched while someone you consider important publicly humiliated him. Not because he was guilty of anything, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was an Omega, because he was wearing a server's uniform, because the system of power you all profit from said it was acceptable. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff had frozen in place, trays balanced in midair. The only sound was the soft sobbing of a few guests who had been moved to tears by Alexander's words. Alexander gently pulled back from Ethan, but kept a protective arm around his Omega's shoulders. His voice softened as he addressed his husband. Ethan, sweetheart, can you tell me exactly what happened? I need to know everything. Ethan took a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. His amber eyes were still wet with tears, but his composure was slowly returning. I was serving water to the VIP table. Someone bumped into me. A glass tipped over. A few drops of water spilled on his watch. He gestured vaguely toward Julian, his hand trembling slightly. I apologized. I offered to have it professionally cleaned. And then he started shouting at me. He said I needed to learn my place. And then he ripped my jacket. His voice cracked on the last words. Alexander's expression was terrifying. His gray eyes had gone cold, his jaw tight with controlled rage. He turned to Julian, his gaze like ice. You ripped his uniform. In front of hundreds of people. You made him kneel. You called him worthless. All because of a few drops of water. Julian was backing away now, his alpha bravado completely gone. His face was pale, his hands raised as if to ward off a blow. It was just a jacket. I can pay for a replacement. I can pay for anything. It wasn't just a jacket, and you know it. Alexander stepped closer, and Julian flinched like a child caught in a lie. You were making a statement. A statement about Omegas. About power. About what you believe they deserve. His voice lowered to a dangerous whisper. And you wanted witnesses. You wanted everyone to see. You wanted to humiliate him in front of the most powerful people in the city. Marcus Sterling stepped between them, his hands raised. Alexander, please. We can settle this privately. My brother. Your brother is a monster, Alexander said flatly. And you enabled him by staying silent. You're the CEO, Marcus. You have a responsibility to everyone in your organization, not just the people who share your last name and your designation. You watched. You let it happen. You're as guilty as he is. Marcus opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The truth of Alexander's words was undeniable. Alexander turned to the room, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. I'm going to say something, and everyone here is going to listen. Every person in this room has the power to stop cruelty. But you didn't. You watched. You recorded. You whispered. And not one of you, not one single person, had the courage to stand up for someone being humiliated. He pulled Ethan closer, his hand resting protectively on his husband's back. This man is not just my husband. He is the most generous, compassionate person I've ever known. He gives away millions every year. He volunteers his time. He genuinely cares about making the world better. And this is how you treat him. Because he's an Omega. Because you can't see his worth. Ethan's eyes blurred with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of shame. He looked up at his husband, at this strong, powerful alpha who could have used his influence to destroy everyone in this room. But he wasn't destroying anyone. He was speaking truth to power, using his voice to expose the ugly underbelly of wealth and status. He was protecting his Omega with the fiercest weapon he had, not violence, not threats, but truth. Alexander, Ethan whispered, tugging his husband's sleeve. Enough. Please. Alexander looked down at him, his gray eyes soft for the first time. Are you okay? I will be. Ethan managed a weak smile, his hand reaching up to touch his husband's face. You came. That's what matters. I should have been here earlier. I should have. You're here now. Ethan leaned against him, exhausted but relieved. Can we go home? Alexander nodded, his hand stroking through Ethan's dark curls. Of course. Whatever you want. He looked at the room one last time, his voice carrying a final warning. I hope everyone here remembers this moment. Not because of who my husband is, but because of what happened tonight. And Omega was humiliated. And no one stopped it. He led Ethan toward the exit, his arm around his mate's waist, his scent calm and steady against the chaos of emotions in the ballroom. They reached the door when Marcus Sterling's voice called out. Alexander. Wait. Marcus had walked toward them, his face set with determination. You're right. I should have stopped it. I should have protected your husband. Not because he's your husband, but because what my brother did was wrong. He turned to Ethan, his expression earnest. I'm sorry. Truly. I should have done something. I should have been better. Ethan regarded him for a moment, his amber eyes searching the alpha's face. Then he nodded slowly. Thank you. I'll make sure Julian faces consequences, Marcus continued. Real ones. Not just empty threats. I'll make sure he understands what he did, and I'll make sure it never happens again. Alexander studied him, his gray eyes unreadable. I'll hold you to that. But tonight, I'm taking my mate home. They walked out into the cool night air, the hotel staff parting to let them pass. The black sedan was waiting, and the driver held the door open. Alexander guided Ethan inside, wrapping his arm around him once they were seated in the privacy of the back. The partition rose between them and the driver, giving them a moment of privacy. I've got you. Alexander murmured against Ethan's hair. I've got you. You're safe now. I'm never letting anyone hurt you like that again. Never. Ethan finally let the tears fall, letting himself be held. His body shook with the force of his sobs, all the tension and fear he had held inside finally releasing. He was so cruel, he whispered. Just because I spilled a few drops of water. Just because I'm an Omega. He wanted to break me. He wanted everyone to see. It wasn't about the water, Alexander said gently, his hand stroking Ethan's back. It was about power. And his ego. And a system that tells alphas they're entitled to treat omegas however they want. He's not special. He's just another bully who's never been held accountable. Ethan nodded against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his husband. I know all of that. But it still hurt. So much. I felt so small. So worthless. Alexander pulled him closer, his hand stroking through Ethan's dark curls. If you want, I can destroy him. I can make sure everyone in this city knows exactly who Julian Davenport Sterling really is. I can make sure he never works again, never shows his face in polite society again. I have the power to do it. No. Ethan's voice was soft but firm. He pulled back to look at his husband, his amber eyes still wet but filled with determination. I don't want revenge. That's not who I am. That's not who we are. If we destroy him, we're no better than him. We're just using our power to hurt someone. You're too good for this world. You know that. Alexander's voice was filled with wonder, with love, with an aching tenderness that made Ethan's heart swell. Ethan laughed a little, a watery sound. I'm just tired. And I want to go home. With you. I just want to be with you. Alexander kissed his forehead, gentle and full of devotion. Then we'll go home. We'll forget all of this. We'll just be together. The story of what had happened at the Crescent Palace Gala spread across the country within days. The security footage was leaked, and millions watched as Julian Davenport Sterling ripped Ethan's uniform in front of hundreds of guests. The internet erupted. News channels ran the story on every cycle. The hashtag Justice for Ethan trended for weeks, with people from all over the world expressing their outrage and support. But what touched people's hearts most was not the torn uniform or the cruelty of the moment. It was the quiet grace shown by the Omega who refused to let cruelty change his character. It was the gentle compassion of a man who had every right to exact revenge, but chose instead to forgive. It was the way Ethan had looked at his husband and said enough, choosing peace over retribution. Donations to children's charities increased dramatically in the days and weeks following the incident. The Brooks Foundation received an overwhelming influx of support, with people from all walks of life contributing to the causes Ethan had championed for years. Hundreds of businesses introduced new workplace respect programs inspired by Ethan's example. Companies that had previously ignored reports of Omega harassment suddenly started taking them seriously, fearful of the public backlash that could follow. Julian Davenport Sterling faced the consequences of his actions. His brother Marcus fired him from every position he held within the family company, stripping him of his titles and his influence. He was publicly disowned by his father, who issued a statement condemning his son's behavior. The alpha who had once bragged about his wealth and status found himself blacklisted from every social circle that mattered. His invitations dried up. His associates disappeared. The people who had once laughed at his jokes now looked through him as if he didn't exist. He tried to apologize, first publicly, then privately. He showed up at Alexander's office, begging for forgiveness, offering anything to make the situation right. But Alexander was unmoved. "My husband doesn't want revenge," he said coldly. "But I don't have to forgive you. And I won't." In the end, Julian left New York entirely, slinking away to a mansion in Europe where he could lick his wounds away from the scrutiny of the world. His reputation was destroyed, his name synonymous with cruelty and entitlement. He would never again be the golden boy of the Sterling Davenport dynasty. Marcus Sterling transformed his company culture after that night. He implemented mandatory respect training for all employees, regardless of rank or designation. He made kindness and employee dignity central values of his leadership, issuing a statement that no one in any organization connected to Sterling Global would ever be treated the way Ethan had been treated. He reached out to Alexander privately to express his deep regret, and to Ethan directly to thank him for his forgiveness. Ethan was gracious, as always. "We all make mistakes," he said. "It's what we do after that matters. You're trying to do better. That's what counts." 3 months later, Ethan stood in the employee break room of the Crescent Palace Hotel, adjusting his freshly pressed uniform. He had returned to his volunteer work, unable to stay away even after everything that had happened. The work was important to him, he explained to Alexander. It kept him humble. It kept him connected to the people he was trying to help. Alexander had tried to convince him to stay home, just for a while. "Give yourself time to recover," he'd suggested. "This doesn't have to be immediate. You've been through something traumatic." But Ethan had smiled that gentle smile, the one that always made Alexander's heart ache with love. "If I stay away, they win. The cruelty wins. And I refuse to let that happen. I won't let one bad experience stop me from doing what I believe in." So here he was, back in the familiar setting of the hotel ballroom, helping to set up for another charity event. The other employees welcomed him with warm smiles, not because he was married to a billionaire, but because he had reminded everyone that true greatness is measured by humility, compassion, and the courage to forgive. One of the servers, a young Omega named Thomas who had been working at the hotel for 2 years, approached Ethan with a box of silverware to polish. He was nervous, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his uniform. "I just wanted to say," Thomas began, his voice shy and hesitant, "thank you for everything you did. I saw what happened that night. I was too scared to do anything. We all were. But you forgave him. And you came back. That takes so much courage. More than I think I'll ever have." Ethan looked up from his work, his amber eyes warm with understanding. "It's not courage," he said softly. "It's just being who I am. I can't let hate change me. If I did, then I'd be just like them. And I refuse to become that." Thomas nodded, still looking overwhelmed. "But you came back. You could have stayed in your penthouse, donated from a distance. You didn't have to be here." "Yes, I did," Ethan said simply. "This is where I belong. With people who need help, not people who already have everything. This is where I learn what the world really needs." Thomas smiled, his Omega instincts calming in Ethan's presence. "You're a good person. That's what I wanted to say. You're the reason I'm still working here." The reason I haven't given up. Ethan patted his shoulder gently. So are you. Now let's get back to work. As the evening progressed, Ethan found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The cruelty, the shock, the revelation of his identity. And then, most importantly, the support and love that had followed. He thought about the millions of people who had been moved by his story, the children who would receive scholarships, the families who would get the help they needed because of the outpouring of support. Alexander had been his rock through it all. In the days after the gala, the Alpha had been more protective than ever, tracking his movements, always knowing exactly where he was. It could have felt suffocating, but to Ethan, it felt like love. Alexander was strong and powerful, and he used that power to protect, not to control. He never tried to make Ethan stop volunteering. He never tried to shield him from the world. He simply stood beside him, a constant presence, ready to catch him if he fell. Their relationship had always been like that. They were equals in everything that mattered, despite the difference in their designations. Alexander respected Ethan's intelligence, his compassion, his strength. Ethan respected Alexander's drive, his ambition, his unwavering commitment to making the world better. They complemented each other in ways that went beyond scent compatibility or biological destiny. Together, they were unstoppable. How are you feeling? Alexander's voice came from behind him, warm and familiar. Ethan turned to see his husband walking toward him, dressed in a sharp black suit that made him look like something out of a magazine. His gray eyes were soft, his expression gentle. He had come to the hotel to pick Ethan up, as he always did on volunteer nights. I'm fine, Ethan said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Better, now that you're here. Alexander reached him and pulled him into a quick hug, mindful of the other employees watching. He pressed a kiss to Ethan's forehead, his lips lingering for a moment. You look good. The uniform suits you. Don't be ridiculous. I look like a server. The best-looking server in the room, Alexander insisted. And I would know. I've seen a lot of servers. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. You're impossible. And you're beautiful. Alexander's hand found his, their fingers interlacing. How much longer do you need to be here? Almost done. Just some cleanup left. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. Probably another hour. I'll wait, Alexander said immediately. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. They worked side by side for the rest of the evening, Alexander helping to clear tables and stack chairs in a way that surprised the other staff. Here was one of the most powerful alphas in the country, willingly doing manual labor, just to be near his Omega. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about his character. Sir, you don't need to do that, one of the hotel managers said nervously, approaching Alexander with a flustered expression. We have staff for that. Alexander smiled, a rare and genuine expression. I'm happy to help. My husband works here. It seems only fair I pitch in. The manager looked flustered but nodded, retreating to supervise other tasks. The other employees exchanged glances, impressed by the alpha's willingness to get his hands dirty. Later that night, they walked home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, hand in hand. The city lights reflected off the river, and the air was cool and crisp. Alexander had dismissed the car, wanting to spend more time with Ethan alone. The night was beautiful, the streets nearly empty at this late hour. I've been thinking, Alexander said after a long silence, his voice thoughtful. About what happened. About everything you told me. About all the people who reached out to us afterward. Ethan looked up at him, his amber eyes curious. What about it? I want to establish a foundation, Alexander said, his voice filled with earnest determination. Specifically focused on Omega rights. Workplace protection. Public awareness. Making sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else. We have the resources, the platform, and the experience. We could really make a difference. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face his husband fully. His heart was racing, but not from fear. This was the man he had married, the man who never stopped trying to make the world better. That's a huge undertaking. Are you sure? It would be a lot of work. A lot of time. I know. Alexander's gray eyes were steady, unwavering. But I think we can do it. Together. Your story, what happened to you, it inspired millions of people. We can use that momentum to make actual changes. Real changes. He reached out to cup Ethan's face in his hands. I want to protect Omegas. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what you went through. And I want to do it with you. Ethan felt tears pricking at his eyes, but they were tears of joy this time. You would do that? For me? I would do anything for you, Alexander said simply. You're my whole world, Ethan. Everything I do because of you. You made me a better person. You taught me what really matters. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. I want to share that with everyone. I want to show them what an Omega can be, what they already are. Not weak, not lesser, not replaceable, but strong, compassionate, and capable of incredible things. Ethan leaned into his touch, his heart swelling with love. What did I do to deserve you? You existed, Alexander said, his voice filled with adoration. You just existed, and I fell in love with you. And I'll keep falling for the rest of my life. They kissed, soft and tender, beneath the city lights. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The world could be cruel, but they had each other. And that was enough. A year after the gala, the Alexander and Ethan Brooks Foundation for Omega Rights was officially launched. It was one of the largest philanthropic efforts focused on Omega advocacy in American history, with a budget of over $50 million in its first year. The foundation funded legal aid for Omegas facing workplace discrimination, established educational programs in schools to combat bullying, and launched a public awareness campaign about Omega rights that reached millions of people. Ethan served as the foundation's first executive director, stepping out of the shadows for the first time. He gave interviews, did press conferences, and even addressed the United Nations on the importance of protecting Omega rights globally. His speech at the UN was broadcast around the world, his words resonating with people of all designations. We are not weak, he said, his voice steady and powerful. We are not lesser. We are not born to serve, to submit, to be silent. We are men and women with dreams and talents and the capacity to change the world. The only thing holding us back is a system that tells us we don't belong. It's time to change that system. It's time to build a world where every Omega can reach their full potential without fear of discrimination, without fear of violence, without fear of being made to feel small. Alexander stood beside him every step of the way, his strong presence a constant source of support. He handled the logistical and financial side of things, using his business acumen to ensure the foundation ran smoothly. But he never tried to overshadow Ethan's work. He understood that this was Ethan's moment, Ethan's achievement. His role was to support, not to lead. Together, they became one of the most influential couples in the country, not because of their wealth or status, but because of their unwavering commitment to justice and their genuine care for others. They were featured on magazine covers, interviewed on television, and celebrated as champions of equality. Marcus Sterling became one of their biggest allies, working with the foundation to establish Omega protection programs in all Sterling global companies. He publicly acknowledged his failure to intervene on the night of the gala and made it a priority to ensure such a thing never happened in his organization again. He funded scholarships for Omega employees, established mentorship programs, and created a hotline for reporting harassment. We weren't there when it mattered, Marcus said in an interview. But we can be there now. We can do better. And we will. My brother's actions that night were a wake-up call for all of us. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. People who had once dismissed Omega rights as a fringe issue now took it seriously, inspired by Ethan's story and his grace in the face of cruelty. The foundation received donations from all over the world, and its programs were implemented in dozens of countries. One evening, Ethan and Alexander sat on the balcony of their penthouse apartment, looking out over the city. The stars were out, scattered across the night sky like glittering diamonds. Ethan leaned against his husband's chest, content, and peaceful. The sound of the city was a distant hum below them, a reminder of the millions of lives they were trying to impact. Today was a good day, Ethan said softly. The Foundation's first major campaign launch went perfectly. We've already gotten calls from 3 other countries asking about implementing our programs. Alexander kissed the top of his head. I knew it would. You've got an incredible team around you. And you've got the most important thing. People believe in you. And I've got you. Ethan shifted to look up at him. I couldn't have done any of this without you. None of it. You could have done everything without me, Alexander said honestly. But I'm glad you didn't have to. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the city twinkle below. The penthouse was quiet, peaceful, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. Do you ever think about that night? Ethan asked finally. The gala. Sometimes, Alexander admitted. I think about how I should have been there. How I should have protected you. How I should have stopped it before it ever happened. You can't be everywhere, Alexander. And you did protect me. You came the moment you knew something was wrong. You wrapped me in your jacket and held me until I stopped shaking. Ethan reached up to touch his husband's face. You're always there for me. That's what matters. I just wish. Alexander sighed. I wish you hadn't had to go through that. I wish someone had stopped him. I wish I could erase that memory from your mind. I know. Ethan turned in his arms, wrapping his arms around Alexander's neck. But it happened. And we've made something good out of it. Something that will help so many people. That's what I focus on. Not the cruelty, but the compassion that followed. Alexander held him close, burying his face in Ethan's dark curls. You're amazing. You know that. You've been through something terrible, and you've turned it into something beautiful. Most people would have fallen apart. You built an empire of hope. I'm just me, Ethan said, his voice soft. Just an Omega trying to make the world a little better. That's exactly what makes you amazing. They kissed, and for a moment, the pain of the past faded away. All that remained was the warmth of each other, the safety of their bond, and the certainty that their love could overcome anything. The world outside could be cruel, but in this moment, they had everything they needed. In the years that followed, Ethan and Alexander Brooks became legends. Not just because of their wealth or power, but because of what they did with it. They built an empire of compassion, using their resources to lift others up, to give people opportunities they never would have had otherwise. The foundation grew beyond Omega rights, expanding to include education, healthcare, and poverty relief. Ethan continued to volunteer at the Crescent Palace Hotel, though now the other employees treated him with the respect he had always earned. He was no longer just a quiet server. He was a hero, a role model, proof that strength and kindness could coexist. The hotel dedicated a plaque to him, and every year on the anniversary of the gala, they held a charity event in his honor. Alexander supported him through everything, always reminding him that he was loved, always protecting him from those who would try to tear him down. Their bond was unbreakable, built on mutual respect, deep devotion, and an unwavering commitment to each other. They were the picture of a perfect Alpha-Omega pairing, but more than that, they were two people deeply in love. And whenever people asked Ethan how he could be so forgiving, so brave, so determined in the face of cruelty, he would simply smile and say, because hate changes nothing. Love changes everything. It always has. It was a simple philosophy, but it had the power to move mountains. It had the power to change hearts. And it had the power to inspire millions of people around the world to be better, to do better, to love better. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inspire kindness and hope around the world. Before we end, tell us in the comments. If you had witnessed someone being humiliated the way Ethan was, what would you have done? Would you have stood up? Or would you have stayed silent? What would you have said? The greatest treasures in life are never expensive clothes, luxury cars, or powerful titles. They are the moments when ordinary people choose compassion over pride, forgiveness over revenge, and kindness over cruelty. Those are the moments that truly change the world. Those are the moments that make us human. In a world that often rewards aggression and selfishness, people like Ethan Morrow Brooks remind us that there is another way. A better way. A way built on love, understanding, and the belief that everyone, regardless of their designation, their wealth, or their status, deserves to be treated with dignity. Ethan's story continues to inspire millions. He represents hope for Omegas everywhere, proof that they are not weak, not less than, not broken. They are powerful in their own way, capable of incredible strength and grace. They can change the world. Alexander Brooks stands beside him as a shining example of what an alpha can be, a protector, a partner, a champion of justice. Together, they prove that no matter what obstacles we face, love can conquer all. Hate is temporary. Love is forever. The night was quiet, the city sleeping below. Ethan and Alexander lay in each other's arms, tangled together in their bed, the sheets soft and warm around them. Alexander's heart beat steadily beneath Ethan's ear, a calming rhythm that had become his safe space. "I love you," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Alexander pressed a kiss to his forehead. "I love you too. More than anything." Ethan smiled in the darkness, his heart full. The world could be cruel. People could be unfair. But in moments like this, wrapped in the arms of the man he loved, everything felt right. Everything felt possible. No matter what came next, they would face it together. And together, they could change the world. They already were.